Many Pentecostals and Charismatics believe that Montanism was the first charismatic revival after the church had grown cold in the 2nd century. But is this really true? Did the Montanists truly possess charismatic gifts such as prophecy and tongues? If you want to find out, please stay tuned for this episode of Digging Deeper. Today's Pentecostal and Charismatic scholars often look with favor at early Montanism. In their understanding, Montanism brought a genuine charismatic resurgence and was unfairly judged as heretical by the early church. This is a viewpoint that you can find in some popular books such as Eddie Hyatt's 2000 Years of Charismatic Christianity or Vincent Sinon's The Century of the Holy Spirit. But before I offer my disagreements, let's get a basic understanding of Montanism. Montanism started in Asia Minor in an area called Phrygia in the late 2nd century. Its founder Montanus was a recent convert to Christianity and quickly became a very successful spiritual leader. However, the early church perceived the movement as both schismatic and heretical. The accusations included ecstatic practices, as well as a heavy emphasis on asceticism and legalism. The critics also pointed out moral issues. For example, Montanus was accompanied by 2 prophetesses, Priscilla and Maximilla. Those women both left their husbands when they were allegedly filled by the Spirit. But even though there was a lot of resistance by the church, the movement was successful for several centuries and spread as far as Rome and North Africa. Even the church father Tertullian was eventually drawn to Montanism at the beginning of the 3rd century. Unfortunately, there is not much historical material to read on 2nd century Montanism. Montanus and his followers had their own writings, but these writings did not survive. This means historians have to mainly rely on 3 sources. 2 of them are critics, which include Eusebius and Epiphanius. And then we also have Tertullian, who defended Montanism. However, it is acknowledged that Tertullian modified some of the Montanist beliefs with his own teachings. That's why I will mainly rely on the other 2 sources. One of the most debated statements regarding Montanism is found in Eusebius, who quotes from an earlier source known as the Anonymous. I know that sounds a little bit complicated, but the Anonymous is an important earlier source, and this is what he writes. And he, that is Montanus, became beside himself, and being suddenly in a sort of frenzy and ecstasy, he raved and began to babble and utter strange things, prophesying in a manner contrary to the constant custom of the church, handed down by tradition from the beginning. The Anonymous is describing Montanus' unorthodox style of prophesying. Montanus is accused of being in a state of ecstasy and talking like a madman. So when the Anonymous refers to babbling, he does not have glossolalia in mind, which is something we will clarify in the next video. No, Montanus is accused of pagan practices, being in a state of trance, raving and saying things that do not make sense from a Christian perspective. The Montanist practice was in fact so foreign to the early church that some bishops tried to cast out their demons. But here's the thing, what exactly is meant by ecstasy? Even today, we can either refer to mere emotional excitement or something more intense, like a state of trance. The latter would be a state in which our physical and psychological functions are decreased. But if that's the case, what do we make of Ezekiel, or Peter, who had a vision on the rooftop, or John, who had a vision in Patmos? All 3 of them were in a state that could be described as ecstatic. I think what is important at that point is to get a better grasp of what the early critics had in mind when they used the term ecstasy. And here it is helpful to look at another statement found in Eusebius' work. He writes, "But the false prophet falls into an ecstasy in which he is without shame or fear. Beginning with purposed ignorance, he passes on, as has been stated, to involuntary madness of soul. They, the Montanists, cannot show that one of the old or one of the new prophets was thus carried away in spirit." What is so interesting about this statement is that the author is not simply using the Greek word ecstasis in the original text. Instead, he uses the word para-ecstasis. So he adds the prefix para to make clear he's talking about an extreme and unnatural type of ecstasy. And then he describes how this looks like. It includes being without shame or fear, and it includes involuntary madness of the soul. In the ancient Near East, this type of condition was usually achieved through ritualistic pagan practices accompanied by dancing and repetitive music. This should also help us to see that the experience of the Montanists has nothing in common with the biblical prophets. In fact, Robert Alden was an Old Testament professor who researched the topic of ecstatic prophecy in the Bible. And this is how he concludes. "There is not one clear instance of a true prophet of Yahweh going into ecstasy, meaning by that term some sort of irresponsible delirium or rage, since the word ecstasy generally has derogatory overtones in our language, apart from its Greek etymology, and is used almost exclusively to describe pagan religious action. We do well not to use it to describe the Hebrew prophets." I think that Alden is right. Even when the biblical prophets were in a state in which their bodily and mental functions were dimmed, they did not become manic. We also have to distinguish between seeing a vision and speaking prophetically. In contrast to Montanus, the biblical prophets always spoke rationally, even when they employed apocalyptic or metaphoric language. Epiphanius argues along the same line. He compares the biblical prophets with the Montanists and concludes that in contrast to the Montanists, the biblical prophets always spoke with a sound mind. So I would argue that if you still want to use the word ecstasy in relationship to the biblical prophets, you should at least have two categories: rational and frantic ecstasy, and the latter should never be used for the biblical prophets. Another issue is that the Apostle Paul would have never accepted someone like Montanus to exercise his gift. In a congregational context, Paul lays out a very different understanding of the gift of prophecy in his epistle to the Corinthians. He writes, "The spirits of prophets are subject to prophets." Paul is basically saying that prophets are in control of their spiritual gift. This is also why Paul can say that God is not a God of confusion. Someone who is prophetically gifted doesn't act like a madman. He is self-controlled and rational. This is also implied in the previous verses where he writes, "Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, for you can all prophesy one by one." You can clearly see how Paul aims for order. Prophets are to speak one after the other, which again implies that they are self-controlled and rational. Now, imagine you had 2 or 3 unbridled madmen like Montanus who want to prophesy.
Oh, Lord. Yes, Lord.
Historians have suggested several explanations regarding the origin of Montanism's heterodoxy. Some conclude that Montanism was simply an erroneous expression of early Christianity. Others, however, say that Montanus came from a pagan background and syncretized pagan practices with Christianity. A possible pagan influence was the cult of Apollo. Apollo was one of the many gods of the Greek pantheon. He was also considered the god of prophecy, and his oracle was located in Delphi. Another possible pagan influence was the cult of Cybele. Cybele was also known as the Great Mother of Anatolia, and she was mainly worshipped in the area of Phrygia. Her cult is considered a mystery religion. This means that insiders receive secret knowledge and practice secret rites. One of the most famous prophetic groups in this cult was the Galli. These were self-castrated male priests who dressed like women. They were known for their ecstatic rituals accompanied by music and dancing. They would also achieve mental conditions in which they believed to be divinely possessed. So what's my personal conclusion on that? I think that Montanus was either influenced by the cult of Cybele or directly involved in it. However, I cannot say that with absolute certainty. There is no historical source that clarifies Montanus' background. So I base my conclusions mainly on two things. The cult of Cybele was active in Phrygia, and the cult of Cybele was into ecstatic practices. Alright everyone, that's it for today. The next video will cover more details about the Montanists, including some of their failed prophecies. We will also answer the question of whether or not the Montanists practiced glossolalia. But until then, I wish you a very blessed time.